Good evening. It's time to start. Hi everyone, how are you? We're glad you left the beach to come to see us tonight. At least we won't have a snow out this December, right? Two of the three places that we normally publicize our meetings didn't come through this month, but you're here anyway, so we must be doing something right, and we appreciate it. I always talk a wee bit about the Historical Society because we always get new people. Historical Society is somewhere 4 to 5 years old now. Was started by a gentleman who, an architectural historian who then had to leave town, and I'm in the appraising of historic property field and jumped in. This is one of the few historical societies anywhere that never has had a cause except education and enjoyment. You know, most historical societies start because there's some battle. We started because people were interested in history and have continued to be interested and keep coming, so we'll keep being here. We do a couple walking tours a year, and we will have 2 this spring. One in the Moorfield area and one in the downtown business district of Squirrel Hill. We always talk about if we could get enough volunteers of starting to work on a house tour in Squirrel Hill, because this neighborhood does not have one. This is about our 45th straight, with 1 month break each year, talk here. And the attendance keeps getting bigger, not smaller, so apparently people like what they hear. We started out very focused on Squirrel Hill. We're now getting broader, at least this year, because of the 250th anniversary. And also because you run out of topics after a while. We're a volunteer group. We welcome memberships. They aren't very much, $10 to $25. We have membership forms in the back. Those of you who are regular members, you will get done for next year shortly, just to warn you about that. We put out the Squirrel Hill book that you've seen in Barnes & Nobles, etc. That's now sold about 3,000 copies. And they would like us to do another one, but no one has the energy to do it. And besides which, this is a funny story, the next logical book to do would be more recent Squirrel Hill than we did in the book. And there are less pictures of newer Squirrel Hill than there are of older Squirrel Hill. The older ones were easier to find, thanks to mainly to Chatham. Next month, Tuesday, January 8th, and I need to tell you, we'll probably start 20 of 8 or so because of schedule. Rabbi Daniel Young of Rosh Shalom is coming. We had Pamela's had to cancel out. He's going to talk about the temple, about the congregation, which of course is in Shadyside, but has a number of members here. But they were very involved in the founding and the building up of the Reformed Jewish movement in this country, and they've been part of some ceremonies. And so I've asked them to talk some about that, as well as about the congregation. In February, Beth Rourke, who has spoken 2 or 3 times from Chatham, who's the godmother of our book because she found most of the pictures for it, is going to come and talk about Chatham, now Chatham University. In March, we have something I've been trying to do for many years, which is to get the fire department to come. And Biggie Goldizer delivered the fire department to a block party at my block earlier this year, and I finally had someone that I could reach out and touch and get a speaker to come talk about the history of the fire department in East End. And then in April, we have a speaker who has worked very closely with the Allegheny County Courthouse and Jail, and he's going to talk on the very well-known Henry Hobson Richardson. We'll announce the last 3 as we go along. Tonight's speaker, Quentin Skrabec, Dr. Quentin Skrabec, is a professor at Findlay University. I know Findlay because of some work we've done, but it's in Western Ohio, and he lives in the Toledo area, but is a native of Swiss Home, and also a native of working in the steel industry. And he's written a great deal about Pittsburgh, and has consented to come over and talk today about the men of electricity and the men of steel, and the rest of the talk is a mystery. So if he would come up, please.
Mike set the topic, and it's a difficult one because he wants me to cover steel and electrical. in a short time. I'm going to deal with the people, and I think the link will be, as you'll see, will be Frick. But I'll try to avoid some of the bigger names like Carnegie, which I think there's enough books out on Carnegie for anybody. So we'll go into some of the smaller names maybe. And really start with the steel people, or why steel is in Pittsburgh, why iron was in Pittsburgh to begin with. And that really goes back to a number of factors. First of all, there was a fort here, and that was the main factor, really. Fort Pitt became the main armory for the United States. Well, through the War of 1812 and into the Civil War, Fort Pitt Foundry was the key foundry for the Civil War, for the Union. Cast about 5,000 cannon, some of the largest cannon around. You can still see them down in Oakland, one of the Rodmans and so forth. But that was the main thing. It wasn't coal, although we had coal in Pittsburgh. Mount Washington, they used to use the coal there in the 1700s at the fort for fuel. But most of the coal for the steel industry comes from Connellsville, comes upriver, up in Onondaga, that are coking coal. So it definitely wasn't coal, and certainly wasn't iron ore. There was the first iron furnace was about a mile from here in Shadyside in 1790, and it failed. It only lasted a year. They were using charcoal at the time, wood, which was common at the time instead of coal. That wasn't the issue. There just isn't much iron ore in the area. Most of the iron ore that came when Carnegie came was coming from already then from Michigan. There is a lot of iron ore we'll mention in the Westmoreland area and the Fayette area and so forth, but even that's limited. So really it was Fort Pitt was the main one, not iron or coal. Transportation, of course, we all know that. The rivers were big. And then another special breed of people, the Scots-Irish, okay, which had a lot of ties internationally to commerce. And by the way, you can ask questions as I speak. I think it's easier. You don't have to wait till the end. Does anybody know who the Scots-Irish are? Are they Scotch? Are they Irish? Are they a blend? Yeah.
Are they Scottish who were planted in Ireland and then decided to move further?
Yeah, that's basically it. And Pittsburgh, in the 1700s, before the Revolutionary War, up until 1860, was about at least 60% Scots-Irish. Okay? We were the capital, really, of the Scots-Irish. More Scots-Irish here than there were in Northern Ireland, is where they came from. They were Scottish by bloodline. When Ireland was sort of put down by England in the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s, through the 1700s, especially Northern Ireland, they wanted to, they took the land away from the Irish, the Celtic Irish there. And one of the ways they tried to keep them down was and they didn't want to move there themselves, the British, they didn't really care for Ireland. So they gave the land away to some Scots, for these Scots could handle it. It was, so the terrain sort of like Pittsburgh, so they moved the Scots in. They didn't treat them any better. The Scots had plantations there. The Scots and the Scots-Irish ended up, they hate the Irish and they hate the English when they came over here. So they tended to be a big factor in the Revolutionary War because of their hatred of the English. And then a lot, as they became a little more popular, especially in this area, a lot of the Irish that came over then sort of said they were Scots-Irish, a little higher step up. So they sort of tried to slide in. The Scots-Irish also were Presbyterian. So that's where the Presbyterian churches came from. But they were the key. And the guy that foreshadowed Carnegie by many, many, many years was a guy that you never heard about. Well, there were two, but one you definitely probably never heard about, James O'Hare. And he came here in about 1790, okay, so it was after the Revolutionary War, and he was a quartermaster at the Fort Pitt. He came with a lot of ties. He came from Northern Ireland, had a lot of ties in Glasgow, so he was a major trader. And the Scots-Irish controlled the international trade at the time. I don't think many people realize that. They controlled the fur trade, they controlled the cotton trade, and the tobacco trade. Almost all the tobacco from the Virginia colonies went through Glasgow. Scotland, not directly to England. So the Scots-Irish were big traders. And iron was part of that. Okay? So they came here and they had the knowledge of iron making, and they came started out in, like I say, east of Pittsburgh, and Fayette and so forth. When O'Hara came to Pittsburgh, he had to get iron for the Army, make cannon and so forth. So he set up the link with these charcoal iron furnaces that you can still see all over that part of Fayette County. Some of you might have seen them. Westmoreland, there's a number of them up there. There's probably 200-300 furnaces in different stages of decay. I'm trying to think. There's several. I mean, there's even a book published on them. You can find them if you want to track them down. But that's how things got started. So they were shipping pig iron in from those counties into Pittsburgh, down to Monongahela, and O'Hara was setting all this up, his family. Another guy, which you at least know the name, is Isaiah Craig, which also, because you're Craig Street, he also was a quartermaster at the fort, so, and Scots-Irish also, and he had all those ties, and they really opened up the iron business in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was rolling iron, and casting it. They weren't making that pig iron. The pig iron is the first product out of the furnace. That was coming down from the hills, mainly small Scots-Irish plantations in the hills north of here, east of here. Okay, so that was the raw material coming in to be used. Those two guys were sort of key in that whole setup, and of course that whole network of Scots-Irish people and the Presbyterians. And, well, there were key things. In the beginning, from 1790 to, well, let's say 1820, there were certain organizations that you had to belong to be a capitalist in Pittsburgh. One of them was you had to be Scots-Irish almost, although they did let a few Germans in, and Bakewell and a few others. You had to be Presbyterian, and generally you belonged to Lodge 45, the Masons, in Pittsburgh, which I don't even know if it existed. I think it still exists, I'm not sure. So those were the key things you had to belong to. And they did their business through those networks. When we get to Carnegie, I guess, there were a lot of pig iron people in here. The Jones and Laughlin and that crowd all came before Carnegie. Okay, I should say 1812, this area for the war really started to do a lot of foundry work. By then, the skies, all the great descriptions of the smoky skies Pittsburgh was already coal dust and smoke. Okay, and that continued through the 1820s, 1830s. We were biggest user of pig iron in the world at that time. Lots of blacksmith shops that were expanding, making nails. Nails was a big product for the West. We could ship west because of the rivers. So there was a lot of growth going on in that whole time period in iron. The bigger blast furnaces, as we would know them, that was mainly charcoal furnaces. I'm not going to get into that difference. I do in several books, but made from wood. Came in the 1850s when they started to build pretty big blast furnace. Jones and Laughlin in the 1850s. The Eliza furnace, the old Eliza furnaces, which ran for 150 years straight. Built in 1850 something, 57. And those furnaces, again, they brought all their material. Their coal came from Connellsville, okay, or from Ohio. The ironwork came from Michigan or from Ohio. Okay, so all the raw material, the limestone was here, all the raw materials were coming elsewhere. But again, Jones and Laughlin, both Scots-Irish, so the old boys network was still in place. It would be Carnegie that would really break that, even though he was Scotch. And he did break into the network. His two biggest supporters. When Carnegie finally got here in the late 1840s and got to Allegheny City, north side, he did get into the network of the Scots-Irish. In particular, two gentlemen in the Pennsylvania Railroad, Thomas Scott, and I forget his name. Baker Edgar Thompson, they named the mill after. He befriended them as a telegraph boy, and of course, his company, and he was in pig iron. or his first few companies. Well, he started with the railroad, of course. His first companies that he invested in, pig iron, basic iron. They weren't making steel at that time, or not in large amounts. He really didn't even get into the business until the 1870s, and that's where I'll start with a few people, the Carnegie Group. His first mill, 1875, is of course Edgar Thomson Works, which still runs today. It's probably now, other than the Crump Works in Germany, the oldest place where steel has been made continuously. I'd say the Crump has an older location in Germany. So it's been made there continuously. Probably, though, in terms of amount of steel made, probably to date, more steel has been made in that one location, in one single location there than any other single location in the world. I don't think there's any doubt on the tonnage records there. So it still holds records and probably always will in the foreseeable future. So Carnegie came and he picked the location. I've got to make sure I split here for similar reasons. Well, first of all, Braddock was just an old battlefield at the time. There weren't many people there. The only thing that had ever existed at Braddock, in fact, Turtle Creek was a bigger town, and so was, I forget the other name. Pitcairn was too. Pitcairn also, yeah, there's another town there. Port Perry was actually the bigger town. You don't even know it now. It was a stagecoach stop before there was anything at Braddock. It was also where the river, they got off, the stagecoach, the river met. And it really was a stop before they got the tunnel for the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the last areas. So it basically is where Braddock crossed the river first time, second time. Crossed back. First time, crossed over and then crossed back. So wasn't much there, he could buy the land. His brother, Tom Carnegie, was the guy that was really interested in steel. They thought this idea of the Bessemer process at the time was going to make steel a material for the future. You see, prior to, well, even during the Civil War, there wasn't much steel made. It was made in very small amounts for swords, for knives. There was no real, you couldn't make it in any tonnage. It was very, very, very expensive. You had to hammer pig iron, heat it, hammer it, rework it. It took a lot of time. I won't get into all the different processes they have, but it just took a lot of time. It wasn't until Henry Bessemer invented the Bessemer process in the 1860s that you opened up the tonnage market. Now the strange thing there, and there is a very, very old book on it, is the guy from Pittsburgh that actually invented the Bessemer process was a guy by the name of William Kelly. He was an Irishman, and he invented it several years before Bessemer. Okay, he never got the patent though. Bessemer got the patent in England, and then got the patent in America before Kelly.
Oh, he was in
He was at Cambria Works in Johnstown. What did I say? I'm sorry.
He said Pittsburgh.
Well, he was in Pittsburgh. He actually was one of the early graduates in chemistry from what was then the University of Pittsburgh. Then they called it Western Reserve, I think. So he actually was out of Pittsburgh. He was Irish and he was out of Pittsburgh. He invented it. They went into a big patent battle in his lifetime, and very few people know this. Finally, in 1880, in the 1890s, he won the battle. He won his case. He was a very old man. By then, it was too late. Bessemer patent was over, and they were making the Bessemer process. Carnegie did visit him at the end of his life, and did acknowledge that he was the inventor. He never gave him any money. He died a poor man, but he did win the patent battle. He does have the honor. Very few people really know that. Turns out Henry Bessemer had sent people over to look at some of Kelly's works. Bessemer was a true inventor. You know, he really wasn't a steelman. Bessemer made most of his money on the postage stamp cancellation, and that was his first invention. He invented a lot of things. He hung around the patent office. He was one of these guys, you know, very creative guy. And so he'd pick up on these things, and he knew steel was coming. There was a big award out, actually, Napoleon III to put it, whoever could make so much steel amount would win, I think it was around $50,000, which would be, well, a few million today. So there was economic reasons to do it. Anyhow, so really it was a Pittsburgher that invented the Bessemer, quote, Bessemer process, and did win in the end, way too late. I think he died 9 months after the patent. Carnegie visited him about 3 months before he died to shake his hand. But that patent battle went on for about 20 years. So anyhow, and for a long time, by the way, the Irish in 1875, when they brought the Bessemer process, that's why we were able to start steel at Edgar Thomson. It started with the Bessemer. The Irish refused to call it Bessemer converter. They called it a Kelly converter. For many, many years. In fact, for almost 40 years, they maintained that Kelly was the inventor. So they held it was a Kelly converters, not Bessemer. Of course, they hated the British. So did the Scots-Irish, but so did the regular Irish. So there was a common hatred there. When Carnegie built his mill, he finally decided to go into steel. He got into steel late. He wasn't the first to get into it by a long shot. But he had lots of money. He had already made his fortune. I won't get too much into Carnegie. So in 1875, he decides to get into steel with the Bessemer process. He brings in the best engineer possible out of New York, Alexander Hawley, who would build a number of Bessemer plants around the world. He brings in, we talked about Cambria out of Johnstown. They were already making railroad rails out there. He stole most of those people. One of them became quite famous for Carnegie and really made Carnegie the fortune in steel. And his name was Bill Jones. Now, you don't hear much about Bill Jones. Anybody ever heard of Bill Jones? Well, there's a Jones Avenue in Braddock. He was a very creative, inventive guy for Carnegie. He was the plant manager of the first Edgar Thomson works. Very famous. He broke almost all, in 10 years he broke every world production record. They asked him to go speak in England after 10 years later, late 1880s. Because they wanted to know, at that time it was like sort of Japan or China. Today they wanted to know, what's he doing? He beat us. They finally surpassed the British in iron and steel production in the 1890s. And he went over and he told them he thought it was a mix of nationalities, and he had a very famous speech that he gave on that. But he was a very famous manager. When he died, and think about this would be very unusual today, he was plant manager. When he died, 10,000 people, the Pittsburgh Press, you can still go down and see the copy down at the library, lined the streets for his funeral. Very popular with his men. He was also Scots-Irish, not Irish, but he was very popular, especially with the immigrants, the Hungarians and the Slovaks and so forth. He was big on giving them rewards. He'd take them down to a Pittsburgh baseball game if they broke a record, and if they broke records, he would have these little rewards, dinners. He was a big gambler. He'd take them to the racetrack. He loved racing. He was quite he was Carnegie's key man in steel. Carnegie knew nothing about steel. Carnegie was an investor. It was Bill Jones. And Bill Jones, the title of my book, Boys of Braddock, was the manager that raised up people like Charles Schwab. He's the guy that hired Charles Schwab as a young boy and a clerk in a drugstore. He brought in all these guys. In fact, he brought in at least 12 managers, guys like Corey and so forth, that would become not only control managers, would be future presidents and managers of U.S. Steel, but by 1920, those 12 men would control 60% of the United States assets as CEOs. They would be in charge of companies like Bethlehem Steel, U.S. Steel, Midville Steel, and those were actually out of the 5 biggest companies in the country. Steel was the big thing then. But they also had International Nickel. Al was one of the men. So these core people, were all brought up and raised by this enlightened Bill Jones. Yes.
I just wanted to say, we went on a tour of Northside, and they said this Jones was the origin of the phrase "keeping up with the Joneses," because his mansion in Northside was so ornate. He wanted to keep up with the Joneses, and that was the Jones.
It might be, I don't know. He has his mansion in Braddock. He had the first superintendent's home in Braddock. It's still there. It's across from the library and across from the Scott's Field, I think.
Bell Avenue.
But he
No,
was no part of
library.
Jones and Locke.
No, no.
The Joneses on North Side were the Jones and Locke.
Probably, I'm not sure, yeah.
Maybe that's.
But he did work at Homestead Works for a while. And he did work over, well, yeah, the north side would have been them,
Yeah.
yeah. He was scheduled, Carnegie, when he bought the Homestead Works, okay, he was scheduled to take over the Homestead Works. That was Carnegie's plan. Not to have Frick, but to have Bill Jones. Because it was a problem plant. Carnegie, Homestead Works existed before Carnegie, and it had union troubles before Carnegie took it over. And he hoped that he could bring in Bill Jones, who was so liked by the men. In fact, the unions had never worked in Braddock. It was one of the few places where they weren't interested in unions because of Bill Jones. And that was his plan. Bill Jones, though, died in a furnace accident. In fact, the guy that held him when he was dying was Charles Schwab, who had been his young superintendent that he had brought up as his assistant. And he had brought him up from, like I say, clerk in the drugstore. So he did die in an accident, which opened up the door then for Frick to come into being. Frick had been Carnegie's partner. Frick had a lot more money than Jones. Frick had been really a top partner of Carnegie out of coal. And Frick came into that, and that, of course, you know most of that story. Although I think Frick gets a raw deal on that to some degree. Everybody disliked the unions, first of all, at that time. The Homestead Union was a radical union. And what few people realize is that it was only that union that went on strike because of all the problems. It was only representing 5% of the men, the high-paid ones, the rollers, the heaters, the puddlers, and they all made more than the supervision. Now, the Hungarians, the Slovaks, and so forth supported the strike, but they were to get no money out of it. They weren't in the union. They weren't allowed to be in an inoculated union at the time. So you think it was this battle against the poor, struggling union. Well, it was the top end of that union. There were 800 people in that union, and there were some 4,000 or 5,000 laborers that were not represented by that union. It had nothing to gain by winning that strike. So, some of that issue is overplayed along the way. Frick's an interesting guy. I just finished a book on McKinley. There were only 3 people they said he ever cried really hard for. His young daughter that died, his wife, and William McKinley when he died. And if you go to Niles, Ohio, you find out something very different. If you go there, sort of forgotten area, the McKinley Library, Presidential Library, almost nobody goes there anymore. In fact, it's almost, the city had to take it over because the endowment from the government's been cut. But it has all these bronze busts. Okay, people that donated money to have this museum for McKinley. And if you go there, you'd think you're in Pittsburgh. Well, the dominant guy is Frick. You don't see bronze busts of Frick around Pittsburgh. He's a bad guy, but he was the dominant guy there. But Westinghouse busts there, Hines, Jones, Benjamin Jones and Laughlin, Carnegie, although they didn't get quite along, Carnegie and McKinley. But anyhow, there was a tie there with Frick. How many have been to Frick's home? Well, then he was a very interesting guy. He was a very family-oriented guy. I mean, this guy is somewhat portrayed as a monster. He's pretty good to his family compared to some of these other guys that we think are much more lovable. And his daughter was loyal to him to the end, of course. So, probably bad timing. He was tough on the union, though, there's no doubt, but that was not unusual at all. We get into Westinghouse, and we will in a minute, the same. And the reason, and where to make the transition, there were so many I could have talked about. Out of that 12, Corey went on to become, well, Schwab, of course, went on to become first president of U.S. Steel. He went on when the U.S. Steel was taken over by the Chicago group, okay, when Carnegie sold out. He tried to get rid of all those Braddock people who were in top structure. And Schwab was a troublemaker. He was a gambler, and he was always on the front page, and he ran around, and it was just problems for these guys. So they had to get rid of him, and they did. They forced him out. Another Braddock guy took over, Corey, but he didn't last much longer. They finally got their own people in. They finally eliminated. Dixon was another, Dixon High School. He was from Swissville. That whole crowd, they eventually got out. Okay. Yes?
The fact that a Chicago group took over, did that have a lot to do with the move to Gary later?
Yeah, it was Judge Gary was the guy that had, Morgan was the guy, the banker out of New York, but the Federal Steel, the other part of the merger, was headed by Judge Gary at the time. And yeah, most of the money went to Chicago. And like any merger, and I was through a merger with Republic and LTV, now one side's going to lose, and they're going to get rid of that side. And they were going to go. Schwab was easy enough because he was a problem. He was a problem. He's always on the front page.
Charles Schwab.
Charles Schwab, yeah. Always in trouble, like I say, gambled through all over York. The other guy was his, let's see, his brother-in-law, Dinky, and his wife was from Braddock, and Dinkies were from Braddock. So they stayed married. Schwab, the last thing to say about that crowd, the boys of Braddock, Bill Jones's crowd at Carnegie, they met all their lives every year into the 1940s. Schwab was the last to die, I think about 1940. But they would always have, and they worked for many different companies, they'd always have this reunion. In the early days, it was at Carnegie's home in New York. But they would always meet. And they did a lot of things. They were called the Veterans of the Carnegie Association, Veterans Association. And if you go to, like I say, now the plaque is really from the Veteran Association. These 12 guys from Braddock stayed as a group. Frick was not part of that group, by the way. They didn't really get along with Frick. Frick was also sort of an outsider. Okay. But the link now, to move very quickly into Westinghouse, the link between Frick and Westinghouse is Westinghouse was Frick's neighbor, roughly. And they used to play poker together. In fact, one of the groups that played were two of the Mellon sons, two of Thomas Mellon's sons, Frick, Westinghouse, a guy by the name of Knox, who later became Secretary of the Treasury under McKinley and a couple other things in government. He was a senator, I believe, from Pennsylvania. But they used to have a little poker group. Westinghouse wired Frick's home. It used to be a gas, and he changed it to electrical, and Westinghouse did the wiring himself. So, Westinghouse, now we'll move to him then. Like I say, break in if you want to talk about anybody in particular. It gave me a tough assignment to sort of split these. But, what can I say about Westinghouse? Okay, well, Westinghouse is from New York, actually, not from Pittsburgh. He didn't grow up here. And he was a German and Dutch. So his mother was Dutch. Got into, his dad had a machine shop in Schenectady, New York, which was later to really become headquarters for General Electric, not Westinghouse, but that's where he grew up. He was a tough kid, very temperamental, threw temper tantrums, that's what he's known for. Had a problem. He liked the machine shop, though, he did. And he liked to make mechanical drawings, which was unusual. He liked to draw things and build them. So he sort of had this natural mechanical aptitude for that, for this drawing and building. He came to Pittsburgh because of Pittsburgh's steel industry. Through his dad's shop, he got into looking at, his first invention was what they call a railroad frog. It helps, it's actually, well, let's say switch. He made the switch and frog. it helped you change tracks, or if, in particular, if a locomotive was derailed, you put this steel frog down and help it rail it back onto the rails, okay? It's a piece of rail, actually, okay? It was called a frog, jump, okay? Jump back onto the tracks. And he had the idea to make these things out of steel. He didn't really invent them, but they had been made out of cast iron and pig iron, and they didn't wear very well. That material is not like steel. It's not as strong. And he wanted to make them out of steel. And he came to Pittsburgh because Pittsburgh at the time, in the late 1840s, when he arrives, 1850s, has all the steel foundries. So he came to look for a steel foundry. And he found one on the north side, a guy by the name of Ralph Bagley, and he got into that business, okay? And he made a lot of money in that business. He'd go around the country selling this. He rode the rails a lot in those days, selling these. But then he had the idea in the 1870s, this date's about right, I'll give you some general dates here. Well, it was late 1860s, for the air brake, which is his major invention. He got that idea actually from what he was reading in engineering magazines in Europe. They were using compressed air to drill underground tunnels. Okay? Doesn't sound like a big deal to us, but they didn't have electricity, and to go in a mile, one big tunnel was a 3-mile tunnel in Europe they were building. Okay, they had to use compressed air. That's how they could deliver force, deliver power. Okay? Factories still today use compressed air sometimes for tools. So he got the idea you could use that for a braking system. You could use it to transfer power. So he designed a braking system using compressed air. Yes?
How did they compress the air if they didn't have electric motors to compress?
Off the engine, the locomotive had an air compressor as well. You know, it turned the wheels, but it also compressed the air. So the locomotive had the compressor, and then you had pipe, or not pipe, but rubber tubing that carried it down through the cars. So you had a place to get it. So from steam power. And he got into that, and it was a big deal in those days, believe it or not. Braking was a huge problem on trains. I don't think we can envision the 1860s and 70s. They had to brake by hand. Okay, you still see them. They still have hand brakes on them. Those wheels on each car. Okay, the engineer would have to signal. There'd be a brakeman on every car on each side, actually 2 per car almost. The brakeman would signal with the engineer would signal with the whistle that was time to brake, and they would all have to try to turn them about the same time. If one turned too fast, you can imagine the car would almost flip. Okay, and the death rate was, and this is a true death rate. Well over 3,000 brakemen every year died, and another 5,000 were injured. And that not only was, they also had to run across. As the railroad in the 1870s, the great railroad strike in Pittsburgh, they cut the number of brakemen, so they had 1 brakeman for 2 cars. Now the brakeman had to run across the top of the car. Well, on icy days and things like that, would lose them. Okay? Now the railroad companies weren't they didn't really care. I mean, Westinghouse would come try to sell the air brake, and they didn't care. Basically, the brakemen were Irish, and they thought they were expendable at the time. And they did lose a lot of them, and the companies, as you can imagine, you know, you're trying to sell a big railroad company on safety, and they're thinking, what do we care? You know, really, we're not really paying if they go. You know, we're fine. He kept pushing it. You know, eventually, and this is how I got to the more recent book on McKinley. He befriends a congressman. Okay, William McKinley, who was head of the Ways and Means Committee in Congress in the 1870s. But he was also head of the Railroad Safety Committee. Because not only brakemen were dying, but there were crashes. In those days, the trains were on one rail, a lot of times, and you had to switch and signal and so forth. There were a lot of head-on crashes. Those made the news more than the brakemen dying. And so Congress had this committee, so that he befriended William McKinley, and they became friends all their life. Westinghouse had 3 homes. He had one in New England, Berkshire Hills, and he had one in DuPont Circle in Washington when McKinley was president. And of course he had Solitude out here in Shadyside. So they were friends, and it was really McKinley who passed the bill, forced the bill through Congress to convert to compressed air braking systems in the United States. And they were still slow. They'd only do it on passenger trains, not freight trains, and it took actually, well, in 1874, 20% of the trains had air brakes. 1876, about 40%. 1880, about 45%. He was constantly trying to get more air brakes, but he finally, I believe it was 1881, pretty much all of the United States had converted, and most of the world. He also, Westinghouse, made many trips to Europe on the air brake. And he had to go through a number of trials. Those are long and detailed. They wanted to make sure the air brake could stop, and eventually he had to make a couple new inventions, one called the triple valve, which helped the compressed air move faster, or delivered it faster at the brake. Long story on that, but brakes where he made his money, okay? By that time, he was pretty much committed to Pittsburgh. He had built his new home over here, not far from the Frick Mansion. And he got into another area then in the, let's see, when did he start? Who knows what the next area he got into? It wasn't electric. Huh? It was gas, okay? Natural gas in the early 1880s. Gas was being, they had found natural gas again out in Westmoreland County, Fayette County, none in Pittsburgh. But he had a geologist, and he believed that there was natural gas if you could drill deep enough. And he drilled over here, and he did hit natural gas. It took him several months, but he hit it. And then he got into the idea of why I can pipe natural gas to industry, the steel industry in particular. And he invented a number of, probably 20 or 40 inventions. Valving, transmission, he got the idea, and this was an important, a simple idea, but it became later important with his electrical systems, was he'd start out with a small pipe, okay, high pressure, and then as you got to the house, you'd make that diameter wider and wider so you'd reduce pressure coming into the house, okay? So you could transmit it a long distance. And he owned what was known as Philadelphia Company, which is a long story, but it was here in Pittsburgh, a natural gas company, and they did most of the pipelines around the city for a decade.
Where did he drill his well?
Right over here, Solitude, his home.
Point Breeze, would you call it?
Oh, Point
That's
Breeze,
what I thought,
okay,
yeah.
yeah.
And he drilled the well over there at the house in Point
Yep.
Breeze?
There's pictures of the well around down at the Carnegie Museum.
Thomas Boulevard, no.
Yeah, no.
I think there's even a plaque still there for the, you were over there, weren't you? You were saying, I haven't been to the park in years. But yeah, that's where he drilled the first one. That didn't last long, by the way. But it got him started on a project. He later then bought wells out in Westmoreland and so forth. He wasn't supplying much out of there. He supplied his own home, some of the neighborhood. It didn't last long. There really isn't that much natural gas right under this area. But if you go down deep enough, you'll catch it. Just like the Pittsburgh coal seam, you'll catch it. So.
Did they get, did he ever go after the gas that's in oil wells in Pennsylvania?
Well, they usually come together.
Yeah, I know they do,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying.
Not the ones you're thinking of, the oil, like up towards Oil City and those, no.
Well, they're not that far, some of them are.
No, most of his that he bought were up out in, by Greensburg, that area,
By Greensburg.
yeah. And he piped it in.
Not the one in Murray's.
Well, Murrysville too, all that out west, or east of here.
There's one that had a big fire.
I don't know about that, but that's where he bought most of his gas from. His main thing was distribution. The well was an experiment. He wasn't really, that never really was commercial. Like I said, I've been he lit his own house with it, in Fricks, and a few others, but natural gas, that's where they got into that business. It was good business. It was a lot cheaper than coal and a lot cleaner. Dirt was a real problem. In fact, yeah.
Isn't there a wonderful anecdote about how we were ready for the Renaissance of Pittsburgh because people alive could remember a wonderful 20-year period when natural
good
gas
point.
had been.
Yes, yes, and I talk about that in the book, yes. After he brought natural gas into Pittsburgh, 1880s, 1890s, before the steel mills got real big, there was about a 20-year period, or maybe less, where the skies were pretty clear, roughly clear, especially out this way, and Swickly. The valley, the downtown area seemed to cluster a lot of the dust and coal yet, but as you got out towards Oakland, where a lot of the capitalists lived, or Swickly, going the other way, there were very clear skies. There was a renaissance. And then the steel industry got into the coal business. They're using coal in blast furnaces, and that changed that. But the coal before that was being used for heating, not for industry so much, as heating and other things.
They didn't manufacture gas from the coal.
Huh?
They must have manufactured.
They could, but they didn't do much of that. In England, they did. That's how they got most
A
of
lot
the
of the
coal.
United States too.
Yeah, they didn't here because of natural gas. They could have. Okay, here we were rich in coal and natural gas. There was no use to go, you go either way. It was good business. Something here. Took, they had to run a cast iron stove in 1883. This was for cooking. It would cost about $12 a year on coal and about $1.50 a year on natural gas. So that's the type of savings. He never really got into the appliance business per se, but he certainly got a lot of industry. A lot of stoves became switched. Also, coal wasn't good for cooking. It wasn't, it had a sulfurish smell and it had some other problems, but people were using it for cooking. So, and we're almost. I know we don't want to go too much further. I'll just finish up his electrical. He got into the electrical late also. Okay, very late in the career. He really didn't get started until late 1880s into the electrical business. He sort of was playing around with that on railroads for brakes, by the way. That's where he started his idea. Edison had already invented the light bulb and had DC systems, direct current systems, in the 1870s. The problem with Edison's systems were DC power is very expensive, and you had to build a power plant about every 4 or 5 city blocks. J.P. Morgan's house in New York was the first to have it. And also it used a lot of copper, more copper than you could even afford. So Westinghouse was interested in AC, alternating current. That's where he got his thing. And he got into that because he also was into the steam engine business. Steam engines were used to generate alternating current. So he sort of went in the back door. He was selling steam engines to Edison at times and to other electric companies. And at that time he had several companies. One of them was Westinghouse Machine, which was making steam engines, besides the brake and the natural gas and all that. So he was really moving into that field. World's Fair in 1893, he wins the contract to light it. That's a big event. He beats Edison out. Edison and J.P. Morgan, who owned General Electric at the time. Edison was really thrown out of General Electric. Morgan threw Edison out, okay, basically. He didn't have much time for a guy like Edison. He didn't have much time for a guy like Westinghouse. So he forced Edison out, but Edison was still frontman for General Electric then. But, so Westinghouse lit the fair. Now they tried, Morgan and Westinghouse, to stop them. They still had the patents on the light bulbs for the fair, and he couldn't get enough light bulbs. So he went into light bulb production here on the north side for the fair, so he could have enough to light up the fair. So that forced him into that whole thing. He eventually, and somebody mentioned a thing, Westinghouse, like I say, he eventually was much smarter than Edison. In a way, he brought a lot of people. He brought good engineers into Pittsburgh. He quit being an engineer, he started to be electrical engineer manager. Testa came to Pittsburgh. Testa couldn't work for Westinghouse. He started with Westinghouse. They clashed. They had such big egos. And they were different, very different mentally. Right and left brain type people. Edison was chemically oriented. He looked at electricity like he always had as a kid. It was generated from electricity. He didn't understand this alternating current stuff, which was abstract. It's abstract today, the electrical engineer, when you take it. So he struggled with that, where Westinghouse didn't have a problem with that abstract. and he could talk to Testa. And he brought Testa in, he set him up, he lived in this big hotel in Monongahela House, which is gone, but that was the rich hotel downtown Pittsburgh. I think something like 15 presidents stayed there. Set him up there. Tesla, of course, was a character. Lots of books on him. He liked to live real well. When he was in New York, you know, he ate at Delmonico's all the time. You know, he lived high off the hog, partied all the time. He didn't really like Pittsburgh, but he liked Westinghouse. And again, they weren't very similar. But Westinghouse always, every night, had a big party out of his house. Late dinners. Had engineers in, they talked, and they drank through the night. Now, Westinghouse didn't drink much, but he always had lots of wine for his guests and so forth. So every night, he liked to go home. His wife, they would have these parties every night. Instead of, he'd belong to the Duquesne Club and so forth, like Carnegie, but he didn't really hang out there. Westinghouse eventually solves all the problems on alternating through Testa. Testa really does all the work, all the patents. The Westinghouse company gets the patents. They get then in the late 1890s, they get the Niagara Falls contract for the first real big generation of electricity. Westinghouse gets that. He builds most of those generators and dynamos and transformers and all this stuff, these great engineers he brought in to build in East Pittsburgh, ships it up to Niagara Falls, okay? And, that really changed the world to AC current, what we have today. Really made it practical.
What was there in East Pittsburgh that attracted you to go to that place?
Well, I haven't talked about, he built his own town, Wilmerding, which was right by East Pittsburgh for his employees. I really get into that. I have a whole chapter on that, which is a hell of a story. He just owned land there. It was good land. There wasn't much. It was farmland at the time. He had bought a lot in the Turtle Creek area, Wilmerding, and East Pittsburgh, which is that whole valley. He had his electrical plants there. He had an air brake company out there. He had part of his machine company out there. He had a foundry up in Trafford. So he had lots of land out in that way. Also, Pitcairn Railroad was out that way. There was lots of railroad connections for him.
When did he build his house in Wilmerding?
He never lived there. He
never
commuted.
did?
Nope, he commuted by train from his home here. Pennsylvania Railroad, we talked about this coming in before. His house had a tunnel that went directly to the railroad station out here. He had a special car. He took his car every morning to East Pittsburgh. He never lived in Wilmerding or East Pittsburgh. He always commuted from here. And he had his own car. He used to travel all over the country. Like I say, he had 3 homes. In the end, he was going between, and he had an apartment in New York. So he had, yes.
That building in Wilmerding, I think the library was in there, and it also had been, maybe still is, a small Westinghouse museum.
Yeah, it's now going to go down to Heinz.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the original purpose of that building?
That was headquarters
Of the air brake?
for the air brake. Air brake was in Wilmerding,
All right,
and East Pittsburgh had the electric.
all right, okay.
Okay, so that was headquarters.
Did the steam turbine come out of Westinghouse?
Steam turbine came out of Westinghouse, yes. It actually came out of Westinghouse machine after he lost the company. And that's the last, he invented that. Yes, go ahead.
Since you mentioned the building in Wilmerding, I just wanted to say that although the museum is gone, the building has been taken over by sort of a community
Yeah.
that somebody donated a wonderful train display that I sort of got roped into helping put up, so I've been there like every night for a while. But you can still get a tour of the building because it was Westinghouse's executive offices. And so the building's open.
Yep.
There are tours. Right now it's decorated for Christmas. It has a great train display. So if you want to go.
Yeah, it's a beautiful building.
It's quite worth seeing. It is a
Yeah.
beautiful building.
I'm glad they're going to do something with it. I know the man there. I was in last week. I was filming a film on Westinghouse, and they spent most of their time out there. And they were hoping they weren't going to lose that building. Everything is going to Heinz, all the rest.
Meanwhile, there's a animatronic George Westinghouse up in the weird little a big attic. It's just sitting there in the World's Fair.
Now that I hadn't seen.
And you go up in the attic, and he's just sort of sitting there waiting to be resurrected.
Wow. Well, that's neat stuff. The one thing I do want to mention, so you know, one last story on Westinghouse that I think you should know. Westinghouse hated bankers all his life. And he made it known. The Mellon family in particular didn't like them. They didn't like each other. And there was a panic in 1893, and Westinghouse got through, his companies through that. He saved his money, he believed in keeping money for his employees' retirement and everything, in cash for the bad rainy day. And eventually, in the panic of 1907, the bankers got him back, especially J.P. Morgan, who owned General Electric and wanted to get rid of Westinghouse Electric or bring it in. During that crisis, okay, that money crisis, he had extended himself in electrical research. He had taken out loans. It was unusual. He had taken out bonds. And that bankrupted they took his, I shouldn't say it bankrupted his company. Actually, it was very profitable the day they took it over. But the banks, J.P. Morgan in particular, and Frick worked for J.P. Morgan at that time, and they were meeting on this panic together, so Frick let them down too. Called in the bonds, and they took over Westinghouse Electric. He lost Westinghouse Electric in 1907. He went into a depression. He never really came out of it, although he did invent some things after. They said they really believed that's what really, he went downhill after that. That was the company he loved, of all of them. And he lost that.
When did he die?
1914, he died in New York. His apartment in New York.
Isn't there a story about the electric streets in Hazelwood?
Oh, coming out of Garrison Alley, those are the first lit.
There's Tesla Street.
Yeah, when Tesla was at his, the plant in Garrison Alley, over here, well, one of the plants was towards Wilkinsburg, but one of the first lit areas was down there, that he ran experiments to light up the streets.
I thought he had built places for his employees. I may be incorrect.
Swissville, he built homes for his employees, Switch and Signal. That was the first place before Wilmerding. Then Wilmerding, he built for his employees.
There's a number of streets that call them Lake
Swissville, that was one of the first lightings. He might have. I mean, I don't know. Although when he built them, homes for employees, he didn't give them like the mine workers did. He helped them on the interest rate and got them the loan back, but he didn't give it free. He didn't believe in that. In fact, you notice Westinghouse didn't believe like Carnegie. He believed the best thing was to give them work and good working conditions and good pay, and let them spend their money. He used to always say. And then Carnegie's idea was, he made the money and then he built libraries and so forth. Westinghouse really had a different philosophy on that, and it was probably a better philosophy. He wanted people to help themselves. I mean, he would help. But
You said that Morgan put pressure and Westinghouse lost the company. What kept it from just being incorporated into General Electric at that time? How did it
The
stay?
bonds weren't owned by Morgan. Morgan could have supplied the cash, or the Mellon family, or Frick, but they didn't. The bonds were called in by Belmont, another financier up in New York, and took it over. But in effect, they no longer competed. Morgan's problem was not so much that Westinghouse Electric existed. They had big patent battles going back and forth. Morgan looked at that as a waste of time. And it was costing General Electric money. So he wanted to, so after that happened, those two companies got together, and they actually had, it would be illegal today, they had a joint board, okay, and they settled it between companies, the patent issues. Also, I might say, Westinghouse would have never lost the company today. That wouldn't have happened. This was before the Federal Reserve. They couldn't call, the company was very profitable the day he lost it. In fact, it was a reporting record. It was a matter of the bonds came due. There was a cash crisis. There's no Federal Reserve. Bankers had the right to call in if they wanted to, or extend. Mellon's wouldn't help, because again, he had bad-mouthed bankers. He wasn't that type of guy, but he didn't like bankers. And they let him die.
Well, here's a story I heard about how the AC came instead of DC. And that is that Tesla, when he came to this country, he was working for Edison.
Right.
They did not get along.
Right.
And but in the meantime, Westinghouse had heard about, Tesla had told Edison about the AC idea he had, and Edison thought, my idea or no idea, only
Yeah.
DC. And
It's
so,
true.
when Tesla left, in the meantime, Westinghouse had found out about the AC idea, and he was very much taken with it, and he went to Tesla and said, I like the idea, come work for me, and that's how Tesla
Yeah, that's
came
basically
here.
it. I mean, AC was known. Tesla didn't invent AC. He had some
That's
patents
what I
on
heard.
the
He did it
transformers.
From
He-
Europe. He had the idea even when he was in Europe.
Yeah, and a lot of Europeans had the idea,
Yes.
and AC was around. What he did invent, though, was some very important things in dynamos, in transformers, and that made it feasible.
I think he had
Yes,
three-phase
those-
electricity.
Yeah, right, three-phase motors, all that stuff. Edison hated that because Edison could think in DC. He could not think in AC. It's an abstract concept.
But then I also heard that in 1893, when the Chicago
Chicago.
World's Fair, they did decide to use the AC to light up the fair.
Right, that was the
And
Westinghouse system.
I understand, yes, at that time it was Westinghouse. And I understand that J.P. Morgan went to take a look, and he decided AC was the way to go.
Yep.
And he came back to Edison and told him, no more money for you, for DC.
He had already pretty much cut Edison out. Edison was just a front man by that time. But you're right, Morgan did decide on his own, AC. There's a lot more to the story then. He actually went to Westinghouse, and he wanted to bring Westinghouse into an electrical truss. But Westinghouse didn't believe in truss. He didn't believe in that. So he refused. Again, he refused Morgan, which was almost the kiss of death. I mean, Morgan, he was the Federal Reserve for the country. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt had to go to his office, during that crisis to get money to save the government. There wasn't a Federal Reserve. And to back it, Morgan had the money, European connections. So,
I have this recollection back in either the 50s or 60s, there was a big antitrust suit against Westinghouse and General Electric breaking that cozy arrangement.
right.
I
That's
forget
true.
exactly about the
Yeah.
time, but it lasted for 40.
Lasted many
50
years.
years.
Yeah, lasted many years. And Morgan wanted that cozy arrangement. Because the real money was being lost in these endless patent battles. I mean, I talk about that a lot in the book. They were endless. I mean, we could get into them later on. Transformers, electric bulbs. Everything was a fight. Everything was in law court. I mean, Westinghouse was dragged into court constantly by Edison and Morgan. I mean, that's just part of the story.
Remember, there was still DC electricity in Upper Manhattan.
Yep, that was the first place.
When I
Pearl
was
Street.
young, a long time ago. Wasn't that
Yeah.
50 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah, there's still some old DC plants around. You can still do it. Yeah.
Was Tesla recruited by Edison, or how did he come from Europe to the United States?
He wasn't really recruited by Edison. He was interested in coming to work for Edison. He came over and did try, I don't want to say applied for a job, but he talked to Edison. He came over on his own. Tesla was pretty, I shouldn't say famous. He was well known for some of his ideas in New York. But Edison really and him just didn't hit it off. I mean, there's a difference between DC. Mentally, it's a pretty problem for Edison. DC is different. If you're an engineer, you know that. DC is easy to understand. I mean, you put two metals in an acid and the wire and there's current. AC is a whole different thing. It's generated, it fluctuates. You need differential equations to quantify it. I mean, Edison hired a mathematician to do his calculations, so you need to be half mathematician. This was made more for Westinghouse as sort of abstract thinking, and Tesla certainly. And Westinghouse gives Tesla all the credit. The plaque up at Niagara Falls has listed on it something like 30-some patents. I think they're all under Tesla's name except one, which is under Westinghouse. So he gave Tesla all the credit, and that's the way Westinghouse was. Edison at Menlo Park and so forth, you worked for Edison, it was all his ideas, all his patents. If you go out there, the guy at the museum will tell you, that Westinghouse only has 400 patents, and Edison, of course, has the record of 3,000, but Edison put his name on all the patents that he got from his people. Westinghouse never did, unless they were really his. He let Tesla or the people have their names on it. And he just wanted the company to make money. He wasn't, you know, Edison was a whole different thing.
This is a wonderful evening. Thank you. Before we leave, happy Merry Christmas. You see the taping in the back. I'm proud to say that a few weeks ago, for the first time, we had a lady who used to live in Squirrel Hill who's doing a doctorate's thesis in Maryland and started to use the archives. We have started to put the tapes on CDs. It was borrowed, it's already been returned. She made a tape, and she's doing a thesis on housing in Squirrel Hill, and we've contributed. So the archives are beginning to work. Have a great holiday month. We'll see you in the new year.